Welcome to The Truth this wonderful Saturday. Thank you for joining us. We've got a good program for you today. We're going to review the debate. Hopefully you were able to catch it this week. We're also going to have a guest appearance from Marci McCarthy. She is the chair of the DeKalb County GOP, which this week, actually on Thursday, filed a lawsuit against Brad Raffensperger, alleging that, shivers, the Dominion machines are not safe and secure like we've been told they are. And we'll get some insight into that from Marci. And then it is going to be a real thrill, I think, to have on our final guest today, Jack Carr. He is an author. He has written 7 fictional books on their spy thrillers. He has written his first nonfiction book called Targeted Beirut. It's an historical look back on the devastating bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut in 1983. And we're going to talk to Jack about his book. And there are so many parallels between what happened in 1983 and what is happening with Israel and Palestine and the other players like Iran. And we're going to get into all of that later in the show. So I hope you'll stay with us. And of course, as always, we welcome your phone calls at 804-778-8888. Well, the debate, the long-awaited debate is done. The die is cast. I'm curious, who do you think won? Tell us in the comments if you're joining us on YouTube, Rumble, or Gettr, who you think won. If you're listening on the radio and you'd like to call us, 804-778-8888. I've given a lot of thought to this, and I've done a lot of reading, and I've really tried to drill down into the debate and come up with the right characterization. And the thought occurred to me that there were 3 players in this debate: Trump, Harris, and ABC News. And so the referee is not supposed to be a participant in the game. It's almost as if you were like in the Super Bowl and your team has the ball, they're down by 3, and they get the ball, they drive it all the way down to the other team's goal line, and the quarterback throws a screen pass, and the receiver runs it across the goal line, and a flag is thrown. Your team just won the Super Bowl, but the flag is thrown, and the referee is over there signaling that there was holding on the play. The only catch would be that the commentators, the announcers, the color guy, and the videographers, they can't find anyone holding the offense, an offensive player. But your team loses. So that would be an example where a referee, and of course, that sort of thing has happened. It happens a lot in college. It happens in the NFL. It's not always fair. Well, I don't think that the debate that was held last Tuesday was fair. There are a lot of polls. There are a lot of questions about who won, and there are a lot of conclusions drawn. And so I've been really torn about, I pride myself in telling the truth. I want to be honest with you all. I put not a high value on that, but that is the measure. So who won the ball game? Well, the team that got the favorable call. But does that tell the whole story? So if we have to give an answer, we're going to say Harris won. It was not Trump's best night. And I think there were missed opportunities along the way, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But the reality is that Trump went into the lion's den. He knew that it wasn't going to be fair, and it wasn't fair. They lived up to the predictions. David Muir and Lindsey Davis were so clearly biased, and they shaped the debate in Kamala's favor. We're going to show you some clips in just a minute. To me, this debate was just more of the same. While I was watching the debate, I reflected back on the Mueller probe, Russia, 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 the Steele dossier, a complete lie, January 6th, Harris had to bring that up, the saddest day in American history. Now, the debate was held on the 10th. That was the eve before the 9/11 remembrances that were to be held the next day. I was really shocked that no one talked about 9/11 on the eve of that tragedy. But to dare say that January 6th was the saddest day in America's history on the eve of our remembrances for those who we lost on 9/11, the 3,000 people that we lost in the World Trade Center, the people who went down on that plane. I mean, Jiminy Christmas. And that's why it reinforced my belief that nothing that comes out of Kamala Harris's mouth should we believe. It made me think about July the 13th in Butler, Pennsylvania, and what I consider to be a massive cover-up. And the 4 trials that they put Trump through, and the dual justice system, and the weaponization of our judiciary, breaking into his house with a warrant for presidential documents that he was arguably entitled to. The Jean Carroll lawsuit, where she alleges that she was raped in Bergdorf Goodman in a dressing room 30 years ago, and the 2020 stolen election, which David Muir had to bring up in his questioning of President Trump, where he asserted that Trump had falsely claimed that he won the election. I mean, it just goes on. And I just think this debate was a natural progression. It was a natural evolution in the way that they've treated President Trump. And the lesson they continue not to learn, the Democrats, the radical leftist Democrats, the lesson that they failed to learn at every turn. You remember when they drug Trump to the Fulton County Jail to check him in, and they took his mugshot? It was on all the front page newspapers the next day and the evening news that night. It created a groundswell of support for President Trump because people knew that it was a sham. They empathized with Trump being mistreated. Well, if you look closely at the polls that have come out after the debate, you're seeing that phenomenon recur. So Trump stood there. He took the blows. He took the unfairness. Yeah, he looked like he was frustrated, and I don't blame him. I was frustrated. Most objective commentators are frustrated because instead of being fair and impartial, the moderators allowed their bias to come through and come through blatantly. Now, Trump was fact-checked 5 times. You know how many times Harris was fact-checked? Zip, zilch, 0. Now, if you don't believe me, just watch this montage of clips.
She copied Biden's plan, and it's like 4 sentences, like run, spot, run. 4 sentences that are just, oh, we'll try and lower taxes. She doesn't have a plan. Take a look at her plan. She doesn't have a plan.
Mr. President, I do want to drill down on something you both brought up. The Vice President brought up your tariffs. You responded, and let's drill down on this because your plan is what she calls is essentially a national sales tax. Your proposal calls for tariffs, as you pointed out here, on foreign imports across the board. You recently said that you might double your plan, imposing tariffs up to 20% on goods coming into this country. As you know, many economists say that with tariffs at that level, costs are then passed on to the consumer. Vice President Harris has argued it'll mean higher prices on gas, food, clothing, medication, arguing it costs the typical family nearly $4,000 a year. Do you believe Americans can afford higher prices because of tariffs?
They're not going to have
Here. I actually met with Zelensky a few days before Russia invaded, tried through force to change territorial boundaries, to defy one of the most important international rules and norms, which is the importance of sovereignty and territorial integrity. And I met with President Zelensky. I shared with him American intelligence about how he could defend himself. Days later, I went to NATO's eastern flank, to Poland and Romania. And through the work that I and others did, we brought 50 countries together to support Ukraine in its righteous defense. And because of our support, because of the air defense, the ammunition, the artillery, the javelins, the Abrams tanks that we have provided. Ukraine stands as an independent and free country. If Donald Trump were president, Putin would be sitting in Kyiv right now. And understand what that would mean, because Putin's agenda is not just about Ukraine.
So you see, not only did they fact check Trump, but they really assumed the position of an advocate for Harris. I mean, look at this little exchange about the tariffs. Here's a prime example of where they didn't just fact check Trump, they started arguing with him and maintaining Harris's position. And I don't know, did you notice that while David Muir was making the case for Harris, that she's seen on camera going, and for those of you on the radio, I'm nodding my head up and down. She's nodding in agreement with what David Muir is saying, as if, yeah, that's right, you got it, you heard me. That's what I've been telling you. It was just nothing less than a sham. And so who won the debate and who lost the debate? You can draw your own conclusions, but I'll tell you, one participant that everybody says lost was ABC, David Muir and Lindsay Davis, and they need to be punished. We need to hit them in the gut and hit them hard and hit them where it hurts the most, and that would be in the pocketbook. So I have watched ABC News because my wife likes David Muir. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, he's a good-looking guy, empty suit, and a biased journalist. So guess what? We're not watching him anymore. And I encourage all of our listeners to do the same. Don't reward them with your viewership. You can turn to Fox. I'm going to go watch Bret Baier now. Here is the solemn truth. I watch David Muir mainly to get the other side. I also watch CNN, and I cringe while I'm watching them. I literally cringe. It is all I can do to restrain myself from not throwing something at the television. But I want to know what they're saying. And I also want to know, have I sort of got it wrong? Have I made a wrong conclusion? I watch them out of legitimate intellectual curiosity and my desire to get it right. That's why I read the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and then go to my go-to, which is Epoch Times and the New York Post. So that's how and why. But here's one more clip that show you the utter unfairness. You know how the debate rules were very strictly written, and how everybody was going to play by the same rules, and how all of the microphones were going to be muted when it was not your turn? How did that play out? Well, watch this.
9th month, 7th month.
Come on.
Okay, would you do that? Why don't you ask her that question?
Why don't you answer
That's the
question?
problem.
Would you
because
veto?
under Roe v. Wade,
Answer the question. Would you veto?
You could do abortions in the 7th month, the 8th month, the 9th month.
It's so obvious what took place. It's so obvious how fundamentally wrong it was. Punish A, B, C. Don't watch them. I used to watch the Today Show. For 40 years, I watched the Today Show. I watched them in college. I set my alarm clock to wake me up with the Today Show on television. I had a timer that I was plugged in, my TV was plugged into. Every morning, I woke up to Jane Pauley and Tom Brokaw. I loved the Today Show. Not anymore. And CBS, I turned to, and I happened to like Gayle King. But then they went off the rails. They went far left. They went with the narratives. So I quit watching them. So I'm glad you're watching The Truth. I truly do take my I don't take myself seriously. I take the responsibility to deliver you the truth very seriously. And I strive to do that. And that's why I sit there and watch David Muir and watch CNN and read the New York Times. I would prefer to be in grammar school with somebody running their fingernails down the blackboard, but I do it because I want to be properly informed. Speaking of which, this week, Dick Cheney, that prince of a guy, endorsed Kamala Harris. He did it out of hate for Donald Trump. So he says. Liz Cheney, he's joining his daughter, who endorsed Kamala Harris, who also served on the January 6th commission. I think it is giving it more dignity than it's worth to call it a commission. How about we call it the January 6th farce? Because that's what it was. They hired a Hollywood movie producer to stage it. They cherry-picked the videos that they showed. It wasn't until the new Speaker of the House started releasing videos that the real truth came out. I still want to know who was Ray Epps. I still want to know who was he working for on January the 6th, 2021. Why has Jim Comey not subpoenaed him but to come before the United States Congress and bring his bank records with him, all of his financial records, including his credit card statements and his expenditures, and find out who was paying him on January the 6th. Christopher Wray says he was not working for the FBI, but was he working for a contractor of the FBI? These guys are so cagey. You can't just ask the obvious question. You got to make it broad so they can't lie. You know, it may not be a lie, but it's not really telling the truth. If Ray Epps was, in fact, working for an FBI contractor, or if there was an indirect link between the FBI and Ray Epps. But I've watched those videos. I've seen Ray Epps in the crowd. There's no way you're going to convince me that Ray Epps wasn't on somebody's payroll, that he wasn't there to try and antagonize and try and stir up the crowd and get them to breach the Capitol. You can see it. You can see it with your own eyes. And, you know, January 6th was a tragedy, but for all the reasons that the Democrats have not told you. It's a tragedy because we lost the life of Ashley Babbitt, a mother, a wife, a former military enrollee, and they killed Ashley Babbitt in cold blood. She was unarmed. She was a threat to no one, and they just gloss over it. And they gave that sorry-ass cop that shot her some kind of an award and a promotion. You know what they were doing? They were buying his silence. They were telling him, we're going to get you off the hook. I don't know. Was he ordered? Was he instructed to do that? It's one of the saddest things I've ever watched. And then there was a lady in the tunnel that was trampled on and severely beaten by the police. Severely beaten by the cops. Beaten to death. Those are the tragedies of January the 6th. Not a single police officer died on January the 6th. They were only Trump loyalists that died. Get it straight, folks, but they won't. So Dick Cheney, Liz Cheney, Taylor Swift, they've all endorsed Kamala Harris. To me, Dick Cheney is about as insignificant as his daughter is, who was censured by the Wyoming Republican Party, and she was drummed out of office by Harriet Hageman, who won in a landslide. And their hubris is such that they think that their endorsement means anything to anybody. I would say, in fact, wherever they've landed, run in the opposite direction. And I'm not alone in that assessment. I have no respect for Dick Cheney. But it's not about Donald Trump, really. It is, but it isn't. They don't really dislike him like they claim to. They dislike what he's going to do to them. They are part of permanent Washington. They are part of the establishment, the swamp, and they don't want the rules changed. They want to continue to feed at the trough. That's what this is about. That's why they're trying to stop Trump. It's not because he was born in Queens and he's abrupt and impolite. I wish he weren't, but you know, you got to take the good with the bad with the good sometimes. I don't know a relationship where there's not some bad that you've got to take with the good. If you've got one, good for you. I mean, I've got people who I love and worship and adore, but it's not always rainbows and butterflies. So I make that case with Trump. Is he perfect? No, but I can overlook, I can accept the things about him that I don't like. But nowhere does it say that we should be electing people based on their personality, even though that's what we do, because that's the simple way to decide. The intellectual way to decide is to look at the facts, look at the evidence, look at the record. That's what Bobby Kennedy has done. That's what Elon Musk has done. That's what Tulsi Gabbard has done. And that's what I do. That is what I do. I have defended Bill Clinton, not because I think he's necessarily a good person. I don't think he's a good person, actually. They don't call her Hillary for nothing. I mean, 60 people that are suspect that had close connections with the Clintons who have died mysteriously or through some kind of violent means. It's enough to make you wonder. And then I watched an intriguing video this week by a pilot for Pablo Escobar. And he said, yeah, we flew into Arkansas, and every time we flew into Arkansas, I dropped off $5,000, and I'm pretty sure it ended up in Clinton's pocket. And we knew that we would not be arrested and that they wouldn't touch us. And we were flying cocaine in by the plane loads. We come to you on Rumble, Gettr, and YouTube every week, and our audience is growing there. We like you to watch us because we live stream there, and we like you to watch us because you could interact with us. And on Gettr, we usually have north of 5,000 people. Rumble, that audience is growing. We've got a few hundred. And we also come to you on the CD Media Network on their 13 digital platforms around the globe. They really care about the truth. They're censored and they're throttled by these high-tech organizations, but you can find them on Rumble and Gettr, uncensored, the unvarnished truth. I'm pleased that they picked up our show and are live streaming it on their platforms. And of course, we come to you on the John Fredericks Radio Network in Memphis, Nashville, Atlanta, Richmond, Norfolk, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and the entire state of West Virginia. I hope I didn't leave anybody out. I don't think I did. Atlanta, did I say Atlanta? My hometown. And by the way, I want to make sure that our listeners get this. I'm going to say it at the end of our interview with Jack Carr. But Jack Carr, this guy is a brilliant guy. And he is coming to Atlanta a week from Sunday. And he will be at the Atlanta History Center from 3 to 5 in the afternoon. And he will be talking about his new book, Targeted Beirut. And it's about the attack on our U.S. Embassy in Beirut in 1983. 270 Americans, innocent citizens, died senselessly in that attack. There's so many parallels and similarities to what's going on in Gaza and the Gaza Strip right now. And the players are actually pretty much all the same. We just fast forward at 50 years and here we are dealing with the same stuff. Okay, so now let me critique a little bit about what I would have liked President Trump to have done a better job of. Now look, he is a great campaigner. He knows how to communicate with people, even if he doesn't do it as eloquently as Ronald Reagan did. Very few people do it as eloquently as Ronald Reagan did, by the way. But I think instead of saying they've botched our economy, he could have supported it with facts. I think instead of talking about what a horrible job they've done at the border, he could have supported it with facts. I think that instead of talking about his position on abortion, he could have humanized it and supported it with facts. So here's where I'm coming from. When Trump was president, we had interest rates of 2% and below. Under Biden, we've had interest rates as high as 7%. Unemployment with Trump got down to a low of 3.3% pre-COVID. It's currently at 4.2%, down from 4.3%. And you may say, oh, well, that's only 1%. Well, you know, the workforce is about 200 or 110, 120 million people. So 1% is nothing. unless you're among the 1%. And that affects about between 1 and 2 million Americans. It's devastating if you're in that 1%. Even if you're not in that 1%, the Biden administration with Kamala Harris as the vice president, and she has bragged, oh boy, she's the last person in the room on every big decision. She's at the table, okay? So she can't say, she's told Trump, she said, well, you're not running against Biden now, you're running against me. Okay, you want to distance yourself from Biden? Well, you should, because together you all have made a total mess of our country in 3.5 years. I'd run from it too if I could, but you can't. Ms. Vice President, you can run, but you cannot hide because the facts are not going to spare you. Inflation has grown from 1.5% under Trump to as high as 9% with Biden. Now, and now it's down to 2.9%, which is going to allow the Federal Reserve, what a coincidence, to lower interest rates next week. Will it be a quarter or a half? I don't know. It probably should be a half. That's a double-edged sword. If they give you a half a point, some people will interpret that the economy is much worse than we think it is. If they give us a quarter, that's what most people are predicting, then it's expected. But that's going to favor the Democrats. That's going to give them the opportunity to say, oh, look at how we've gotten the economy back under control. We've got inflation down to 2.9%, and we've got unemployment down to 4.2%, and it's dropping like a rock, unless you're a member of that 4.2%. Gas under the Trump administration was $2.60 on the average. Why didn't he say that? Because right now, it's been as high as $4 and over $4, and now it's somewhere in the high threes, mid to high threes, depends on what part of the country you're in. If you're in California, it's still over $4. Milk was $3.80 under Trump. Bread was $2, and those prices are just off the chart. And if you're a family and you're working and you're trying to put bread on your table and milk for your children and gas in your car to get to and from work and to carpool your children back and forth from school, it's significant. It's a real problem. And on the border, Trump had the illegal influx into America slowed to a trickle comparatively, 300,000 illegals a year. They've allowed 10 million in 3.5 years. And Trump is right. They have allowed murderers and rapists and thugs to come into our country. And I keep asking myself, how could you? How could you? It's like if you owned the Mona Lisa and you splattered it with white paint. How could you? I mean, why would you take a great country and allow people to come into our country that are just going to bring us down, and they're going to take food, they're going to take money from our citizens who are struggling to get by, and they are taking jobs. Last week we gave you the statistics. As I recall, there's been a loss of 1 million jobs by American citizens, and there's been a gain of about 1,100,000 by non-U.S. citizens. Do the math. Illegal immigrants are taking the jobs of our citizens. Trump should say that. That's how you make the case that the border is in disarray. And why? Why would they do that? Well, Barack Obama says because he wants to change the fabric of America. And we know that Biden wanted to do it so he could bring more people into the country and give them Obama phones, the use of a motor scooter, free housing, food, spending money, so they'll go vote for him. That's how they're going to cheat. I don't know whether we can overcome it. I don't know. But we're going to fight. We're going to take the position that we can, and we will. And everybody listening to this broadcast today needs to take a pledge. You need to raise your right hand and say, John, I swear. I feel like that guy on TV. come over to the television and put your hand on the television set, and I will pray for you, and you pray with me. But you raise your right hand and say, John, I swear. Don't worry. Your husband or your wife, they'll come into the room and they'll be raising their hand. That I will find one non-likely voter and take them to the polls and vote on November the 5th. And if you're in Pennsylvania, you could turn the election. Our listeners in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, thank you very much for tuning into The Truth today. You have the greatest potential of any state in the union to swing this election for Trump. But I'm telling you, you've got to come out en masse. More people have got to come out than they can Cheeto with. That's the only way we're going to beat them. Because you heard Marci McCarthy talk about the machines, the problem with the encryption, and the fact that passwords are out there floating around, and if you work hard enough, you can find them in the public domain. And if you're evil and you're bad and you're willing to break the law, you can go break into a voting machine with that password and you can alter votes. And you don't think that stuff is going to happen? Well, we better wake up, smell the coffee, get to work. Just if everybody in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and in Pennsylvania who are listening to this broadcast today will go identify one unlikely voter and say, hey, Bob, hey, Susie, why don't you ride with me to the polls on November the 5th? Or go take them to early voting, or get your elderly relatives an absentee ballot. Help get people to the polls. That's how we're going to win. And Georgians, my friends in Atlanta, Trump can't win without Georgia. And it's a 50-50 state right now. It is a 50-50 state. We got to get serious. You got to get your friends, your relatives, your kids, every voting age person that you know. Round them up, take them with you. Make it a voting party. A buddy of mine has a dinner that he hosts, and if you come with I voted today, he'll buy you dinner. That's not saying that you're not paying them to vote for your candidate, but you can reward them for going to the polls. There's nothing wrong with that. You just can't reward them for voting for the person of your choice. That's illegal. It is a fact that larceny and theft have increased during the Biden administration. It is a fact that Kamala Harris raised bail money for people who looted and burned in Minneapolis in 2019. It is a fact that she wants to decriminalize drugs. And it's a fact that she triggers me, she makes me angry when she then goes on national television and tries to be empathetic about people who have lost their loved ones, their children, to fentanyl overdoses, while meanwhile she's advocating decriminalizing drugs. How sick can you be? How duplicitous, how dishonest can you be? How bad can you be? And she wants to decriminalize illegal aliens. Yay. You can walk across the border, but we're not going to prosecute you criminally. It's going to be a civil violation. I don't even know what that means. Are they going to have to pay? What is the civil penalty? You're going to have to pay $50? You're going to have to pay a fee to get in? It's really sick. It's really bad. And we've got to work as hard as we can for the next 60 days, or less than 60 days. Early voting starts next month. We have got to work, and fight, and help get Trump across the line and into the White House so we can save our country. And you may think that's hyperbole. I don't. I am not saying that lightly. I am not saying it out of exaggeration. I'm saying it because that's what I truly believe. And Kamala Harris is lying to the American people. For 4 years, they have opened the gates and allowed people to come into this country from the Central America and South America and God knows where else. Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan. Christopher Wray says that terrorism is a clear and present danger in our country today, right now. And now she wants to act like she wants to close the border. She said that her campaign said that she's in favor of completing the wall. How duplicitous can you be? She tells you that she has great empathy for people who've lost loved ones to fentanyl, but she wants to decriminalize drugs. She tells you that Bidenomics is working. How? How is it working? $7 trillion of reckless government spending on the Inflation Reduction Act, which Biden himself said last week we should have named it what it really is. It was a Green New Deal Act. So she's flip-flopped on the border. She's lied to us about Bidenomics. She reiterated this narrative on Charlottesville, which has been blown so out of proportion. Probably wasn't a very smart thing for Trump to have said in the moment on reflection. She talked about 2020. David Muir attacked the president, said that he falsely asserted that he had won 2020. And in fact, yeah, he says that the election was stolen, but I don't think I never heard him say turn over the election. I never heard him tell Mike Pence to go up to the Capitol and turn the election over. What I did hear him say loudly and clearly, call a timeout. There is enough smoke that we need to drill down in this and find out whether we had an honest and free election. Take 30 days, do the investigation, call in the FBI, call in the state election boards and their local law enforcement, get the ballots, get the ballot images, reconcile the tallies, look at the voter rolls, and determine, was it an honest, free, and fair election? And if it wasn't, then you got to figure out a remedy. And that's what happened in Bush v. Gore. They had so many election anomalies in Florida, hanging chads, remember that? That they said, well, we're going to go to court. We're going to let the courts work it out. The courts ended up being appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court gave a formula for going and recounting the election. And they put people in place with supervision and both parties and the news media present, and they recounted the election. Bush won, according to the recount. All right, so that's the debate. I've gone on longer than I intended, but I think that I think there's a lot to unpack. And I conclude that I don't really care how you decide who won the debate. Trump didn't have a great night. Kamala Harris was very well prepared. Trump was not well prepared. I fault him and his team for not spending more quality time preparing. But, I fault Kamala Harris for being over-prepared because she sounded so robotic and programmed. She just kept saying the same stuff over and over again. But so did Trump. He kept coming back to immigration. So I'll give the nod to Harris that she won the debate, but only by a hair and a big footnote. It was rigged. It was a setup. And David Muir and Lindsey Davis did not play fair. And they shaped the debate. So then what do you do? How do you call the debate then? I just say, I can't come up with a conclusion on who won. All I know is who lost. And that's ABC, David Muir and Lindsey Davis. Congratulations, David. You lost a viewer. I ain't going back. To heck with them. All right, we'll be back right after these words. You're listening to The Truth on the John Fredericks Radio Network. We hope you enjoy watching The Truth and listening on the John Fredericks Network as much as we enjoy bringing it to you. Now, if you do enjoy it and you'd like to reward us, all you have to do is go to rumble.com, JohnGordonTruth, Gettr.com, look for John Gordon Truth, or YouTubelive.com, and John Gordon Truth, and hit the subscribe button. It costs you nothing, but it will do a big service for us. It'll help us reach more people. And if you like it, hit the like button. Have a great weekend. It's my pleasure to welcome to The Truth today an American hero. Jack Carr had the dream as a 5-year-old of going into the Navy, becoming a Navy SEAL, and becoming a writer. He has realized both of these dreams. I guess he is best described, I would, as the original badass. This guy has lived more life in his short years than most 20 people that I know. Jack Carr, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me on.
I'm very intrigued with how you have gone from Navy SEAL to best-selling author. But I do have a few preliminary questions. I actually think once a badass, always a badass, probably, especially in your case. But do you like honey in your coffee?
I do.
Do you dislike mayonnaise?
I hate it. Disgusting.
And do you have a hat that says BRCC?
Many.
So do I. One of them is heated. I love that thing.
Oh, nice. Okay.
And you probably are wearing some Solomon boots right now.
I have socks on right now because I'm at home, but the Solomon shoes just came off my feet because I just came in from outside.
Okay, so that is all a lead up to my question, and that is, are you really James Reese in disguise?
No, he is much faster, stronger, a better shot, wiser than I could ever hope to be. We do share a similar background, though, in that we were both former enlisted snipers, became officers. And when the reader meets James Reese in the first book, he's finishing up what will probably be his last deployment, because that's the last time he's going to tactically maneuver guys on the ground, because he's an 04. So that's a lieutenant commander in the Navy, a major in the other services. And that's where I was when I got back from Iraq, my final deployment, and took a breath, looked around, and decided that it was time to move on and that my family needed me. And if I stayed in the military, I knew I would come back eventually to teams after a couple of staff jobs and then come back maybe as an XO CO at some point. But what you're doing in those jobs these days in the military is essentially leading from behind. You're more of a manager. You're not out there with the guys kicking indoors, tactically maneuvering on the battlefield. And the guys don't want you out there at that stage. You've been out of the teams and staff jobs for long enough that you're just going to mess things up on the ground. So really you're allocating assets back in a tactical operations center. And for me, my specialty, I think something that I was good at, was maneuvering troops on the battlefield and doing that tactical level leadership job. So it was very clear to me that it was time to move on. We also have a middle child with severe special needs who needs 24/7 full-time care forever. So it was time to shift focus. And that's when I started writing. So I correct one thing from earlier, is that it was age 7 that I wanted to be a SEAL. I knew I wanted to be in the military my whole life, but age 7, I found out about SEALs through a movie called The Frogmen, old black and white films. So their culture. And then when I knew I wanted to be an author, because my mom was a librarian, so I grew up surrounded by books and a love of reading. You can tell from my background here.
Your mom was a teacher, right? And she turned you on to books.
Yeah, reading was as natural as anything else growing up. And so 6th grade for sure is when I knew that one day after my time in uniform that I would write thrillers.
Well, you're really blessed. Not too many 7-year-olds really get to live out their dreams and do it on such a grand scale as you have. But I do want to ask you, you've got a new book out. It's called, well, before we do that, I want to let our listeners and our live stream know Jack has written 7 nonfiction or fictional books called the Terminal List series. And the first is The Terminal List, True Believer, Savage Son, Devil's Hand, In the Blood, Only the Dead, and Red Sky Morning. And you can find those on Amazon and also on Audible, which is where I have to confess I've found most of them. But, you know, Jack, I'm telling you, I'm not blowing smoke. These books, I'm through the first 2. My wife, who you met a moment ago, has read all 7, and she's really the one who said, John, you and this guy are on the same page. You really need to invite him on your show. But these books became my best friend. And when they were over, I was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry it's over. But then you don't disappoint because there's one right behind it. But these are truly page turners. I want to know how much is really grounded in truth and how much is it truly fictional? And as a reader, you know, I'm wondering, well, did this really happen? Or is something inspired it, obviously?
Yeah. So, I mean, they're all inspired by different things that happened, either things that we're aware of in the news, maybe some things that's happened to me downrange. But I call it fiction with whispers of truth, because that's really what it is. And then on my 4th book, The Devil's Hand, I started to include an author's note at the end, because I was getting so many questions just like this one about what was true, what's not, what's real, what's fiction. And so for book 4, The Devil's Hand, it's really about bioweapons research, what the enemies learned by watching us on the field of battle for, at that point, almost 20 years at war. And so I thought, well, I'll include an author's note now that lets people know what was was real and what was not. So I've done that with every book since The Devil's Hand. And I think that, and that's been fun for me too, because I like to explain what was real and what wasn't to clear things up, essentially. But I think that, as you said, and thank you so much for the kind words, but I think why this character has resonated is not because I bring in things exactly as they happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, but I take the feelings and emotions behind things that happen to me downrange, and I put those into a completely fictional narrative. So an example would be if my protagonist is ambushed on the streets of Los Angeles, California, in a completely fictional narrative as part of the story, then I think back what it was like to be ambushed in Baghdad, Iraq, 2006, and I take those feelings and emotions and I apply them to the fictional narrative. Or I remember what it was like if I have a sniper scene in a sniper sequence of chapters, then I remember what it was like to be a sniper in Iraq, to be in Ramadi, to be in Mosul, to be in Najaf. And I take those feelings and emotions and then I apply them to the story. So I don't have to go out and find someone who was a sniper in Ramadi at the height of the war and then interview that person and have that person's answers go through different filters that I may have, meaning documentaries I've seen, movies I've seen, preconceived notions, other interviews that I've done, other books that I've read. And so I don't have any of those filters. It comes directly from my heart and soul, directly onto the page. So I think that has made this character resonate. And then the other thing that kind of parallels this is that James Reese, my protagonist, is on a journey. So what you're supposed to say, I think what the publishers like you to say, is that you can pick up any of these books in any order and read them because they all stand alone. And okay, yeah, that you can, but I would recommend starting at the beginning and going all the way through, because I think it's a much richer reading experience for people who do it that way, because my character is evolving along the way. He's not static. And that's something that all of us have in common. Every single person on this planet is on a journey. And so because they're not individual books that stand alone, that resonates with people as well, because they can identify with someone who's on a journey, who's learning from past experiences and then taking those lessons and applying them going forward as wisdom to a current problem set. So I think both of those things have really made this character in the series stand out.
Well, my wife, who you met earlier before we came on, actually started with book 7, and she was just overwhelmed by what a great book it was. And so she turned me on to it, and she said, but whatever you do, start with book 1. And so I did that, and I'm up through book 2 now, and I intend to finish the series in due time.
Very well. That's very wise. So I think they get better each time. So that's good. That's good for you, because my goal is to always get better regardless of what it is that I'm doing. In the SEAL teams, I wanted to be a better leader and operator today than I was yesterday. I want the next book after Red Sky Morning to be better than Red Sky Morning was. And I think each and every one has been better than the previous book. And that's always my goal, to make it better, to improve as an author, and then also to push the genre forward, even if it's just by a degree, because really what I'm doing is building off this foundation of all these authors who I read growing up. And I was very fortunate to read essentially the masters early on. By 6th grade, I was reading the same books my parents were reading. So that means Tom Clancy and Nelson DeMille and David Morrell, who created Rambo in 1972 with First Blood. That's Robert Ludlum. That's A.J. Quinnell. That's J.C. Pollock. That's Mark Olden. There's all these guys who were essentially the masters of the thriller genre. And I got to read them at that time, when my only job was to essentially be either out of sight or be seen, not heard as a kid. And there weren't all these distractions around that we have today. So it was either go outside and play, because you can only play Atari 2600 video game for so long, and then read. So I got to read all of these masters without having to worry about a mortgage or a car payment or kids or my wife or a job. The only thing that I had to do was read these books because I loved them and was enjoying them, and I fell in love with the magic in those pages. And I think that's a different reading experience. Had I woken up at age 40 and decided I wanted to be an author, and then thought, well, what should I have been reading for the last 30 years. And I didn't have to do that because I'd been reading for all of my life, building this foundation, which helped me in the SEAL teams, because I wasn't just reading thrillers my whole life. I was reading everything nonfiction I could find on warfare, insurgencies, counterinsurgencies, anything that I could find that would help me be a better SEAL, be a better operator, be a better leader. So all those things kind of came together at the right time and place. All the thrillers that I had read, all the nonfiction that I had read, the practical application of warfare on the battlefield in Iraq and Afghanistan, and all those things came together, I think, at the right time and place, and allowed me to do what I'm doing now.
Well, it's really a gift to enjoy reading, and our third son is a prolific reader, and he reads nonstop, and he has acquired so much knowledge as a result of it. And since I was 12 years old, I've always been enamored with earning money and making it in the world. So I've worked, and I've never been a big reader, but I'm starting in my later years to find time to do more of it. But so now you were in the Navy.
Audiobooks, right?
I'm sorry?
And you're finding it in the audiobooks.
Yeah, well, both. I also have a stack of books on my nightstand, and I have put them in rank order of how I'm going to attack them. I feel like an audiobook is a little bit of cheating, frankly. There's something gratifying about actually sitting down and reading and completing a book, which I'm doing with Targeted, which we're going to get to in just a second, because it doesn't exist in Audible at this point. So
it will on September 24th.
Of course. We're going to talk about that in just a second.
Same narrator, Ray Porter. And on audiobooks, it's interesting in that audiobooks are the fastest growing segment of publishing. And I think a lot of that is because of what we're doing now, because it's the same medium. So someone can hear us talking here, they're already listening to something, and then it's a natural thing to then listen to a book. So I think the popularity of podcasts and things like this are part of the reason why audiobooks are the fastest growing segment of publishing. And I got so lucky with my narrator, Ray Porter, who's just an amazing guy. So the audiobooks are very popular.
Well, I resisted Audible for a long time just because of that paradigm that I thought you were kind of cheating, not sitting down and reading the book. But now I've fallen in love with Audible, and it really makes exercise go so much faster, so much more enjoyable. Taking a car ride is so much more enjoyable with an audiobook. So I've really become a fan. All right. So you were a Navy SEAL for 20 years. You saw action in Iraq, Afghanistan, the Philippines. I mean, you were in the hot spots of the world for 20 years. And not only were you in the Navy as a SEAL, but you were also a sniper. So I'm thinking you really look danger in the eye. Am I right about that?
I don't know about that. I mean, it's just a natural thing. You becomes your normal because you're in this community of people who are all doing the same thing, that are all there for essentially the same reasons. So I never really looked at it that way. I guess some of it is a test, particularly in the beginning when you want to test yourself in some of the toughest training ever devised by a modern military, which is what BUDS was advertised, SEAL training was advertised as, which was part of the draw for me. But the whole time, and the action in the Philippines was a little different. It was really an advise and assist mission, meaning I was attached to a Philippine Marine element and their general, actually, I took the position of being essentially a student because he'd been fighting an insurgency in the Southern Island chain for all of his adult life. So I really got to be essentially a student and then help them out with some of our more technical capabilities. But they were the ones going in, really doing the job, and we'd support with medical and intelligence and that sort of a thing. But I learned a ton on that deployment, even though it wasn't kinetic as the ones in Iraq and Afghanistan when you're kicking indoors in the middle of the night or coming in on targets in vehicles or aircraft or whatever else. But it was a dynamic 20 years, I would guess you could say.
So tell us about Iraq and what was your experience there? And as a sniper, you had to see combat, right? I mean, you were in the thick of things.
Yeah, I mean, the one that stands out when you hear combat, because a lot of what we did was choose the time and the place of the engagement, meaning that we were stacking the odds in our favor. When that one instance where that didn't happen was in Najaf, summer 2004, which was a campaign to retake this city from the Jaish al-Mahdi militia. And I had a small sniper element, and I was attached to 27 Cav, which is a large army element. They had Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles, and we had almost constant air overhead for about 2 weeks, 11 days of which was pitched urban combat. And that was the kind of combat that was very similar to what I'd watched growing up on TV with my dad in these old World War II movies, because it was night, it was day, it was constant, there was no stopping, and you're using similar type of tactics, and you're using things that look kind of like what you saw in the movies. Bradley fighting vehicle and an Abrams tank are much more modern than we had in World War II, but still some of that similar technologies and similar tactics. So I remember being in the thick of it and just thinking, oh my gosh, this is kind of like the movies that I saw saw growing up as a kid, where some of the other things where you're stacking the deck in your favor, where you're building target packages and you're waiting for essentially a trigger to let you know that your target is at a certain place at a certain time. And then you go in there full force to grab him out of his bed in the middle of the night, drag him back to base, turn him over for questioning, and go hit another target. So it was dynamic. And a lot of these my novels.
It sounds very intense. How did you handle it psychologically? And were you married at the time? Was your wife back stateside?
Yeah.
And how did she handle it?
You know, that is amazing for wives and even parents, like how they must have to kind of disassociate from that or compartmentalize it, because you're on obviously an off cycle where the day is not the same, it's not the same time zone. And then when they're sleeping, you're probably out in the middle of the night doing the job. So I think they must have to compartmentalize it, because it would be horrible to be sitting there constantly thinking about it the entire time. And we have kids, so she had her hands full for most of the times that I was deployed, which I think gives you also an outlet. But when you're deployed, you're not worried about really any of that stuff. And the divorce rate in the SEAL teams is very high. It is, I think, in the military in general and special operations, I've heard it's even higher. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but I can see why. Because when you're in the teams, you have to, the pendulum has to be on the side of the teams. And for us, I very clearly articulated that to the family, because that's what you owe the people that you're taking down range. That's what you owe them, their families, the team, the mission, the country by default. So the pendulum has to be on that side. But if you talk about it and that's understood, and also understood that maybe one day it won't be on this side. One day I'm going to leave this job and the pendulum will come back to the side of the family. So I think it's important to understand that. And I think you have to have that mindset, because otherwise you're doing a disservice to the guys that you're leading into combat.
Well, I want to stop and thank you sincerely for the sacrifices that you made for our country and for our safety, and to shield us from having to live through what you lived through. And so we all owe you a sincere debt of gratitude. And so thank you. What was it like when you were in the thick of battle? And I would assume that you lost friends.
Yep. I lost friends over that 20 years. I was very lucky not to lose like anyone right next to me, type of a thing. But over 20 years, you lose a lot of guys in training. And training is inherently dangerous in and of itself in combat. And then sadly, after the fact as well, when you're home on the home front, just with the suicides and everything else. So yeah, training, combat, and on the home front, you lose quite a few people, unfortunately.
So your latest book, which is nonfiction, it's titled Targeted Beirut, and it harkens back to April the 18th, 1983. I was somewhat of a youngster then, not anymore. You're still a youngster.
I don't know about that, but yeah, it starts with the embassy bombing in Beirut in April of 1983, and then leads up to the barracks and headquarters bombing on October 23rd of 1983, where we lost 241 service members in a bombing. And for me, when I knew I always wanted to move into nonfiction at some point, and I weave a lot of history into my books as it is. I talked about a lot of historical events on my social media channels, but when I built up enough, let's say, political capital with Simon & Schuster, and felt comfortable enough to now be able to pitch this nonfiction idea to them, I wrote down about 3 pages worth of terrorist events, really from the end of World War II up to today. And unfortunately, that's a very long list. But I kept coming back to Beirut 1983 as such a pivotal time in our relationship with the Middle East. And so it was very natural to start with that one. I remember as a kid, the Newsweek and the Time magazine covers, those are the 2 magazines that we got at our house. I think later we got U.S. News and World Report, but then it was Time and Newsweek. And I remember those covers. I've tracked them down again. I have them actually right in the other room here, but I remember them on our dining room table. I already knew that I was going to be going into the military. Even at that young age, I knew that my war, my generation's war, was going to be against some element of terrorism. And it was very clear even back then through the nonfiction I was reading and through the fiction that I was reading as well. Once again, the power of popular culture. So I kept coming back to April through October of 1983. And then having experienced what I did in Iraq and Afghanistan, the least that I can do now as an author who's a student of history is to capture some of these lessons so we don't make the same mistakes going forward, or at least they'll be captured. Whether we listen to these lessons or take the right lessons and apply them as wisdom, that's something else. But at least I can capture some of the lessons from this event. And there wasn't really the seminal work on this event yet. Even all these years later, you couldn't say, if you were asked about what book should I read on Beirut 1983, on the headquarters and barracks bombing in October of 1983, there's not a book that someone can say, oh, you have to read this book on the subject. That didn't exist yet. And I think a lot of that is because the Marine Corps in particular not necessarily wanted to forget, but as an institution, when you have something that's not as glorious as raising a flag on Iwo Jima, you have something that maybe certain elements of leadership look at as perhaps a black eye. It's not remembered in the way that it should be. And it's kind of swept aside. And that's how a lot of the veterans that I interviewed actually felt about their time in Beirut and about how the Marine Corps treated them in the aftermath of this horrific event. And so for me, I wanted to capture these lessons and humanize the event as well. I think that's very important because there's an 18-year-old, 19-year-old, 20-year-old kid out there who is the last decision maker in a chain of decision makers that starts at the President of the United States and then goes all the way down to this kid who's standing at a checkpoint watching a vehicle approach. And maybe that vehicle looks like it's a little heavy, it's overladen with something. Is that a car bomb, or does it just have bad suspension? Well, that kid is the last decision maker in that chain that starts at the top. And these policies that are conceived in air-conditioned offices thousands of miles away from the battlefield, they need to know that the end result of those decisions is this 18-year-old kid that's standing there on a post with a finger on the trigger, weapon off safe, deciding whether or not they should fire. So I tried to capture all that, humanize it through the experience of some of these guys who buried in the rubble, others who are first responders, digging their friends, brothers in arms out of this rubble with their bare hands, with K-bar knives, maybe a shovel or a crowbar if they could find them, in this race against time to save as many lives as they possibly could. So there's a lot to capture in this story of Beirut 1983, and that's the least that I can do is do that in the pages of a nonfiction work.
Well, as you have just been talking, you triggered so many thoughts that I have wanted to ask you about today. And you talk about lessons learned. And Jack, as I was reading Targeted, it made me think that what we're witnessing right now in the Middle East between Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza feel to some extent deja vu all over again with what you wrote about in Beirut. I don't know what lessons we have learned, really, and I don't think that we have learned anything about how to deal with this crisis that's been going on since the 1940s, maybe beyond. And as long as I have been observing the news and reading about it, to this day, I can't tell you that I really understand what these wars are about. It appears to be about religion. It appears to be about territory. It certainly appears to be about politics. But it seems like the most complicated set of problems to try and reconcile that I've ever looked at. What do you think? What is stirring all this up, and why can it not be resolved?
You're on the exact right track. There are all those factors at play, and that makes it so complicated. And to complicate it further is that every country or organization that has a stake in the Middle East also has internal politics at home, not just the politics of the region. So let's say you have Israel. Well, yeah, they have certain politics on the home front as well, and they have civilians in charge of the military. Back in the United States, we have political pressures from all sides, and we have a civilian in charge of the military. And every other country, Iran, essentially the same thing. They have internal politics at home as well. And when it comes to this region, yes, very complicated, but Iran has had its fingers in this mix from the beginning. And when we look at Beirut 1983, I mean, really the seeds of Hezbollah, they were planted a little bit before this. They were watered, but really it turns into the organization that we'll come to know as Hezbollah really during this time period that I write about in this book right here. Essentially a proxy force of Iran. And since this time period, really the United States and Israel both have been playing Iran's game. And Iran has been very successful in using proxy forces to try to get what they want. But then, as you noted, there's religion in here, and especially when we talk about Lebanon here, you have Sunni, you have Shia, you have Druze, you have Mennonites, you have Israel coming and going out of the battle space. You have the U.S. putting peacekeepers, and that was the thing that was said over and over again from the administration. These are peacekeepers. We're putting the Marines in as peacekeepers, something that they were not trained to do. And once again, they were put in a tactically disadvantageous position by senior level leaders. And we see that in August of 2021 in Afghanistan, where we had some high ground, quote unquote, high ground at Bagram. So a tactically advantageous position, yet we once again put 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old kids at Abbey Gate in Kabul in a tactically disadvantageous position. Very similar to what happened in Beirut. But what's also interesting, all those years later, but what gives me hope about some of this, and not on the senior level leader side, but those same 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old kids, those junior officers and enlisted that are standing at these posts, that when this bomb goes off in Beirut, when the bomb goes off at Abbey Gate, what happens? Those that survive run to the sound of the guns, try to save as many of their brothers in arms, and in this case, in Afghanistan, sisters in arms, service members as possible, holding security. They don't know if there's another bomb coming. Same thing in Beirut, 1983. But point being, you had U.S. service members running to the sound of the guns. And that part gives me hope. That service member is still that same soldier, sailor, airman, Marine that we've always had. And they're going to always run to the sound of the guns because of this duty and because of that person to their right and left. So that's been the same. And unfortunately, at the strategic level, what is also the same is putting our service members in tactically disadvantageous positions.
Well, the dogs are cheering in the background for you. I apologize. One of the occupational hazards of having your studio at home. But one of the parts of the book that you talk about, which was really kind of a look behind the curtain, was when Michael Deaver ran into the President Reagan's office and said, "I'm resigning. I'm out of here. I can no longer be a part of this barbarian sacrifice of human life." And he really, in the book, you make the point that he got Reagan's attention. And Reagan said, "You're right." And he immediately called his counterparts, the prime minister, and said, "You have got to stop this." And it brings me, again, back to the current day. And I have thought, and I just went to Milwaukee a couple of months ago to the RNC, and I've spent an afternoon and I walked through the area that was designated for protesters. And I spoke to people on both sides, pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, some of them even dared to try and defend Hamas. But it made me think there are probably legitimately two sides to this story. And I'm not advocating this. I'm saying this because I want you to help set my understanding or inform us. But my perception is that the Palestinians in Gaza probably have been persecuted and denied basic human rights. It's one of the poorest places on earth. I think that food and water are at a scarcity for some, and it's a bad place to live. But my retort to that is, as much as I want to be compassionate, when someone cuts off the head of a child and kills a pregnant woman, there is no way to be compassionate toward them, or kill 200 people at a pop music festival, which is exactly what I said to these pro-Palestinian protesters that turn a complete blind eye to that, and in fact are in denial that they've done anything that is wrong or barbaric as the things that I just described. So how do you reconcile that? And is there any merit to what I'm saying, that there is a case to be made for humanitarian treatment toward Palestinians, but obviously not Hamas?
Yeah, just like in every war, the civilians pay the price. Just like in Lebanon, civilians pay the price. And when we're talking about, I'll get back to Palestinians in a second, or my thoughts on it anyway. But when we're talking about North, so we're talking about Hezbollah, which is now essentially the leading party of Lebanon. Iran doesn't care if Lebanon gets turned into is just a complete wasteland. They don't care how many people in Lebanon get killed. It's a buffer zone. It's a proxy force. It's a strategy that has worked for them for decades, and they'll until the paradigm changes for whatever reason, they're probably going to continue to use proxy forces like that. But they're certainly not looking out for the best interests of the Lebanese people. And very similar with Hamas, in at least my understanding, in Gaza, the West Bank to is another area, but there's all these things are connected. And though maybe Hamas isn't a direct proxy force of Iran like Hezbollah is, there are certainly linkages. There's no doubt about that. And really, I think that the Palestinian people, they are the ones that are suffering because of their leadership. And whatever happens at the end of this war in Gaza, then I just talked to Haviv Reddick Gur the other day, who's a former IDF medic and who is a journalist for the Times of Israel. And even he expressed to me that Israel owes the Palestinian people a lot. And it's going to have to be a part of this, obviously, and any sort of reconciliation that occurs when hostilities are over and when Hamas is essentially eradicated. And then you get back, of course, come around to how do you kill an idea type of a thing? And that is Hamas an idea, or is it a group of people who can be killed and destroyed? And you can probably kill and destroy a group like this. But really the Palestinian people, they're the ones that are suffering because of that leadership. And it's heartbreaking.
Well, I appreciate your insight, and it does help me understand better what is going on. Do you think that there is? I mean, I'm a conservative Republican. I've run for public office as a Republican. I make no secret of it, nor any apology for it. But I am quick to say that I think that our two-party system in America today brings out the worst in certain elements of our society, and it's the fringe elements of both the Republicans and the Democrats, the far right, the far left, that really give each party a bad name. But it used to be that we could have a conversation and a competition for ideas, and people seem to be willing to accept outcomes and results, and we would all work together to make it work. Today, it seems to be a zero-sum game. No, it's all of what I want and none of what you want. And the point that I'm trying to make is that the Middle East, Iran, seems to be very much in that frame, that it's all about what they want. There's no coming to the middle. But the fact of the matter is, I just don't know what it is they want. Do you? Do you know what their end game is and what their objective is in all of this?
They want to certainly push Israel into the sea, kill every last Jewish person, not just in Israel, but in the world. I mean, there are different levels to this. What comes first and what comes second? First is the destruction of Israel. And of course, long term, it's reestablishing that caliphate worldwide. So there's different levels to all of this. And it's not simple. There are complexities to this. Let's say one of them being Russia's relationship with Iran vis-a-vis the U.S.'s relationship with Israel. So I think this is why some people pressure Israel to exercise constraint in going into Tehran and assassinating people, or going off and doing these things to either destabilize that regime or to put some of these proxy forces on their heels. Well, I think that, and this is just speculation, that some in the U.S. would rather have them exercise constraint, because if something does turn into a regional war, although I don't believe we have a treaty with Israel, we would probably come to Israel's defense. And the Russian interest in Iran right now, essentially their front sight focus is the drones that Iran is supplying to Russia that are being used so effectively in Ukraine. So if either Israel or Israel with the help of the United States destroys these factories or tries to destroy these factories in Iran, well, then Russia now has a vested interest in keeping that from happening. So that's the larger scale war that moves outside of the confines of the Middle East. So it's not totally cut and dry. What is cut and dry is that anyone who crosses a border, comes in, specifically targets innocents, kills women and children and elderly, and that is the very definition of terrorism, is going after civilian targets for a political end. And those people just need to be killed.
Well, the thing that bothers me the most about the Iranians, and Jack, I know a lot of people not a lot. I know a handful of people from Iran that live in the United States. They're some of the nicest people I've ever known. And what they will tell you is that the people, the Persians are very nice people. They have a wonderful culture, but it's the leadership that are corrupted and despicable. And it seems to me that that rings true. It has the ring of truth. The thing that really bothers me about it is that they do the kidnapping, they do commit the atrocities, they engage terrorists, all in the name of religion. And I think that is the most despicable part of the whole conversation, frankly.
Oh, sure. There's that. And then you can also go back to the 60s, the early 70s and see pictures in Tehran. And it looks, I mean, they're Coca-Cola signs and everyone's wearing Western dress. And it looks like an amazing place to visit. I was talking to somebody not too long ago who took a motorcycle back in the 60s, or maybe it was early 70s, and they went all the way to Tehran on a motorcycle, like a BMW motorcycle. People backpacking through Europe in the 60s, college kids used to have an exotic experience by leaving Europe and going to Afghanistan and going to Kabul as part of this backpacking through Europe. They would zip over there, and there's amazing pictures of Afghanistan from that time period where you could go and explore and have an amazing experience and come home and have that be part of your experience moving forward. And that not anymore. You don't really spend too much time in those places as a traveler today.
So we're speaking with Jack Carr, a very successful author, former Navy SEAL, retired and followed his next passion, which was to write fiction. And he's got 7 books in the Terminal List series, and now has come out with a new nonfiction book called Targeted Beirut. And we're coming to you on the John Fredericks Radio Network across up and down the Eastern Seaboard. And we're also on the CDM platform on their 13 global platforms and media outlets. They stand for the truth. They're being throttled. They're being censored. They want to get the message out. We're honored to be on their platform. So, Jack, one of the things that surprised me about the books that I've listened to so far in the Terminal List is the amount of redaction, particularly in True Believer, that is present there. These are fictional works. Can you help me understand where our national security interests lie in redacting elements of a nonfiction book, or of a fictional book, rather?
Yeah. So I wanted to be just extra safe because it was so close to me being in the military. So I sent the first one in to the Office of Pre-Publication and Security Review, just to be safe. And they came back with, I think it was just 9 redactions. So it wasn't too bad. And they got back, they said they were supposed to get back in 30 days. They got back in 45. And I thought that's pretty good for a government agency. And so I just kept those in there because I didn't know, because are you supposed to now write around those things? And if you do, are you supposed to send it back? Because how do they know what you wrote around? The whole thing is totally ridiculous because there's nothing that keeps anybody from writing a screenplay. There's nothing that prevents someone from going on cable news channel and talking without having their speech checked by the censors, as it were. So I sent it in, did that, published it with the redactions in there. Second one, same thing, sent it in. And 1 month passes, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months. I have to push my publication date from, I think it was from March to end of July, which was not helpful. And they came back with, I think it was 54 redactions, either sentences, words, paragraphs, whatever. But this time now I have a couple attorneys. And so I have them tie every single redaction to a publicly available government document. So that means not something that someone else has written or something from Wikipedia, but something that anyone on the planet can download from the United States government itself. And so all 54 of those redactions were tied to publicly available government documents. And none of it was anything that I learned in the SEAL teams. But they came back and I won that appeal. Because there's a set of things you need to do to appeal. I won on 37 of them, I think it was. So what I did was I unredacted them for the paperback so that now people can compare the hardcover to the paperback and see which things that the government thought was worth redacting and what I won on appeal. And so the third book came along and I did that as well. And then I went back to appeal and they said that they would not accept my appeal, even though it was done exactly how you're supposed to do it, how it's laid out, and how the previous book was. So I think they just didn't like that I published the unredacted version after the appeal in paperback. And so anyway, my take from it was that they said, hey, quit bugging us with this fiction, kid. We have very important things to do here in this office on the nonfiction front, and we can't be bothered with you. So going forward, and enough time had passed also between my time in the military and what I'm writing about. So the next one was The Devil's Hand, and that one was all about bioweapons and bioweapons research. And I had no touch point with any of that in the military. I knew nothing about it. That's all research done post-military for that book. Same thing with In the Blood, the next one. There's an AI component to it and quantum computing to it before ChatGPT became part of the lexicon. And same thing. I had no touch points with quantum computing or artificial intelligence in the military. So now I don't send them in.
But you did develop a special relationship with Alice, if I understand it correctly.
That's right. That's right. So I'd be surprised if what I describe in The Blood isn't almost exactly like it was at least a couple of years ago when I wrote that book when it comes to AI and quantum computing as far as our capabilities go. Because when you talk to people, you have to do when you're investigating or researching something like that, where I'm starting from ground zero, essentially. Then you talk to as many people as you possibly can. First, you do as much research as you possibly can so that you can ask informed questions. And when you're talking to someone who's spent a lifetime doing this, they can say, as you ask these questions, at least this guy has done some research. He's put in some work ahead of time. So that helps build maybe some trust with that person that you're talking to. And they're very close-lipped, of course, about everything that they're doing in these worlds, but they'll give you a little hint. And then you talk to somebody else who gives you a different hint. And then you talk to somebody else. So you paste this thing together, kind of paste this mosaic together like an investigative journalist would. So that's what I did with the quantum computing AI. That's what I did with the bioweapons research. And to a lesser extent, that's what I did in Only the Dead when it came to finance. I wanted someone, I know nothing about finance, and I wanted someone who had spent a lifetime on Wall Street to read these couple chapters in Only the Dead and say, this guy put in the work. Even if there's a few things that are not quite right, I use a term that's not quite right, they can sense that I put in all this work, and they can say, okay, got it, and respect that I at least took the time to put in the work. So I try to do that with all my books.
How would you divide the time between research and writing? Because I know that you research these books extensively. I mean, my wife and I have talked about it. Like, how does this guy get all this knowledge? I mean, that's got to take just a huge amount of time to develop the information that you're putting into the books.
Yeah, but luckily I have a lot of it just as part of my personal experience, except when it comes to things like what we just talked about, the bioweapons, the AI, the quantum computing, the finance. But a lot of the other things are already a part of me, or I'm aware of them and know where to go to add to that knowledge if it's going to be a part of the book. My original idea was to go somewhere for each of the novels. First one, I'd already been to Iraq and Afghanistan. It was mostly domestic based, so I was good there. I was still in the military when I started writing that. I had about a year and a half left to go. I was dropped my papers and was getting out. Second one, I'd already been to Odessa, Odessa, Ukraine. I'd been there before I was in the military, so I chose that as a location. I'd been to Morocco before my time in the military, so I chose that as a location. I had not been to Mozambique. So I went to Mozambique, even though I didn't have a book deal yet from the first one. I flew to Mozambique, spent a couple weeks on the ground there, getting to know professional hunters, trackers, getting to know the area, the politics of the region, taking pictures of the soil, of the trees, the animals, just anything that I could possibly do to add that local boots on the ground flavor to the novel. So my plan, once again, was to do that with every book. Savage Son, I went over to Kamchatka Peninsula, Russia, over there, flew from Anchorage in, because 1 month, I don't even know how it is now with the war in Ukraine, if there are restrictions or not, but back then, I could fly from 1 month a year from Anchorage into Russia. So you don't have to go all the way around the world the rest of the year if you want to get to that same location. So I put boots on the ground in Kamchatka Peninsula because I knew that was going to be a very important part of the book, just like Mozambique was with True Believer. So did that. Then for the next one, COVID hits. And so everything's pretty much on lockdown. Luckily, that was a very domestic focused book as well. The next one, In the Blood, still have these lockdowns, but I really wanted to go to Israel because there's a significant part of the book that takes place in Israel, and I just couldn't get there. If you remember during COVID, if you were trying to get into Israel, even as an Israeli citizen, it was difficult to get in and out of there. They were very strict on it, so couldn't get there. So I sent the manuscript, or I sent that portion of the manuscript to a family in Israel, and they had somebody in their 30s read it, somebody in their 60s, somebody in their 90s read it, and I was, and I did so much research because I really wanted to try to get it right. And they all came back and said that they couldn't believe that I hadn't been there for that. So I'll eventually get there. But so that was the point of me saying, as far as research goes, my plan was thwarted by COVID. And now there's so many projects going on. I'd like to get back to that though, where I go to a location. I tried to get back to it for Only the Dead, so 2 books back. And I went to Argentina, and I thought that this certain section of that book was going to take place there. And then even in the outline, it was Argentina. And then I got to that place in the narrative, and it just didn't make sense. It just didn't work naturally. So I'll save Argentina for another time. So for people who have read Only the Dead, the Colorado portions of the book were originally in the outline supposed to be Argentina. But yeah.
So when you ventured into Russia as a writer / journalist, I think that's probably what the Russians would have called you, weren't you a little concerned about your personal safety? I mean, you're over there poking around and asking questions, and developing sources.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. So this is before the war in Ukraine, of course. So I go over there, I think it was August, maybe September of 2019, I think it was. And I'd been, like I said, to Mozambique doing this similar type of research a couple of years prior. And everyone there wanted to tell me about their country, about the politics, about the poaching situation, about the Chinese influence, mining operations, illegal and legal, and just tell me everything. They're so open and so wonderful in Mozambique. I really just had to ask a question, and it would just flow. I thought the same thing would happen in Russia, because that was one experience doing this. It was Mozambique. Here's my second one. Now I'm going to Russia. Exact opposite. Very quickly, I realized why. Because if someone throughout Russian history is asking questions, kind of like the ones that I'm asking to write a sort of a political thriller, where I'm asking questions about government and military and that sort of thing, you weren't long for this world. You were off to the gulag type of a thing. And that's, I think, ingrained in them, this suspicion of people asking questions and what the consequences of answering those questions could be. So very quickly, I realized that, this is going to be a different thing over here. But I was also in the backcountry for most of it. So it was a fishing trip and a hunt as well. So I was back there.
And a lot of questions interspersed between. Did anybody ever come and talk to you, question you, feel you out?
No, they made some jokes about me being some sort of a spy or something like that. But eventually, after you warm them up, and a little vodka always works. I learned that in a previous trip that I had taken to Russia a long time ago, and then a military trip that I took to Uzbekistan years ago as well. How the vodka flows freely, and people will share things with you once they start pouring.
Well, I know James Reese liked to offer some of his victims vodka before he did them in, at least one that I read about. So,
you're already at
I happen to remember that because I have a particular fondness for clear liquid. Now, so you do all the research. You get this idea. You in your mind, you develop a storyline, and you start to put together an outline. And then you go do the research and then come home to write? Or do you research, write? Is it linear, or do you work on parallel tracks? How does that process work?
Yeah, so what I thought was going to happen didn't happen. And that was that I would come up with the concept, come up with an executive summary, come up with the outline, and probably somewhere in that process, I would go somewhere that I knew was going to be vital to the storyline. And I would go to that place and continue working, but also do research. And as I described, that it did not work out that way after the third book due to COVID. But what I've done as far as process has been the same essentially every time. And I like to come up with a title very quickly, because I don't want any bandwidth wasted thinking about a title or thinking, oh, geez, I've had great titles so far. I can't mess this one up. So I come up with a title. I come up with a theme that guides the writing process. Each book has a distinct theme. Then I come up with a one-page executive summary, kind of like what you'd read on the back of a paperback or the inside flap of a dust jacket, or maybe a description on Amazon, that sort of a thing. And then I take that one-page executive summary and I turn that into the outline. And then when I get to a certain stage in that outline, I have a beginning, middle, and a few things in between, but I don't let the outline hold me up. Meaning if I just can't figure out how's he going to get out of this in the outline, I don't let that hold me up anymore, because I know I have a year to figure it out. It's not like being on the battlefield in Iraq and Afghanistan when I have to make a split-second decision that's going to affect all those around me forever. I can sleep on it. And I can even write a chapter. And if it doesn't work out, I can get up the next morning and change it. So
do you sit and type? You type at a computer? You type it all out? yourself?
Yeah, type it all out, and then I'm doing research. So I get to a part now, like let's say for Only the Dead, where I get to that finance part. Oh boy, here I go. So I do as much research as I possibly can and write it out, and then I'll send it to people in the world of finance, or I did in that one anyway, those chapters, and say, hey, what am I doing wrong here? And can I talk to you about this? Here's the general storyline, and this is what I want to get. This is the intent of these chapters. Can we jump on a call and talk it through? And so that's kind of how it plays out.
I've got 2 more pages of questions, and the clock is just running like crazy.
But we can do it again sometime.
Well, I certainly hope so. But let's move on for just a moment. You and I think, share a lot of the same beliefs. One of which is, I think, in one of your books, you said, and I don't know whether this is your perspective coming through in the book or whether it was a fictional account that someone made, but that you considered JFK's assassination the day that America lost its innocence. I certainly do believe that. Give us an idea of exactly where you're coming from. And to me, it sets up a whole cascade of dominoes that we see falling one at a time that cause me great concern for my children and grandchildren.
Oh, sure. I think every book thus far I've mentioned the JFK assassination in one way, shape, or form. Not that it's a major plot element, but it's part of a conversation or part of somebody remembering something or somebody taking a lesson from it and applying it to a current problem set that's fictional in the story. So I think I've mentioned it in every one, and that is because it was such a turning point in the history of our country. Really, you have the reorganization of the intelligence services and the military after World War II, 1947. Now they're not called the Department of War, Secretary of War. Now it's a Department of Defense and a Secretary of Defense. And we build this essentially a system and an ecosystem that still exists today, self-licking ice cream cone type in some cases. But we build this entire military and intelligence establishment that has only continued to grow over time, has only continued to have larger budgets, more power. And when we look at 1963 and you look at the Warren Commission in particular, why was it not called the Dulles Commission report? Because Allen Dulles ran.
Thank you very much.
There's just too many questions lingering, and there were too many opportunities for presidents to declassify documents that they neglected to do so, even after there is a law passed that says they must by a certain date. That date came and gone. They tried to use COVID for a little while about the reasons why they couldn't do it. But all these years later, still not declassifying documents. And yes, we overclassify everything. But November 1963 was a distinct turning point in the history of this country and still continues to impact us today.
So we had on David Talbot, who authored The Devil's Chessboard.
Oh, yeah, it's over here. I got it right here.
Yeah, that's a great book. And The Unspeakable by MacArthur. And then The Men Who Killed JFK by Roger Stone. And we've had all those people on the show. And I was home with the flu on November 22nd, 1963. I was 10 years old. I went downstairs after having slept for like 12 or 15 hours and said, you got to get up if you're ever going to get well. And I walked down the stairs to our black and white TV, and my mom was there. And she said, oh, John, come and sit next to me. And the tone of her voice sounded foreboding. And as a 10-year-old, she was a very loving and nurturing person. The fact that she wanted me to sit next to her wasn't surprising, but the tone of her voice was that something's not right. And I said, Mom, is everything okay? And she said, no, John, the president has been shot. And I did not even know how to assimilate those words. What do you mean the president has been shot? I mean, that was a concept that was so foreign to me, never even entered my psyche that could happen. And then I sat in front of that TV with my folks for the next 4 days and watched the events unfold and developed a very unhealthy obsession about the JFK assassination. It was really not until I read The Devil's Chessboard that all the pieces came into place for me. And I realized that Allen Dulles, I do firmly believe, planned, orchestrated, carried out the assassination of JFK, and that Hoover and Johnson covered it up. So, gets us to the present day. There was an attempt on President Trump's life July the 13th in Butler, Pennsylvania. To me, there are a lot of similarities. How about you, Jack? What do you think?
Well, it's just bizarre. It's just so bizarre that specifically after 1963 and all the security protocols that have been put in place since then, that you leave this building. I mean, once again, just like Well, the withdrawal from Afghanistan. You don't need to have any sort of experience in the military. You don't have to have read a book on strategy or tactics. You don't even have to have watched a military movie. You can look at Afghanistan 2021 and anyone with any common sense could have planned that withdrawal better. You don't need a background or an education in military history, tactics, strategy, operations, anything like that. You could apply common sense to that problem set. Similar thing here. You don't need to have a background in security operations or with the FBI or with the Secret Service or in the military or anything. You could just look at a map and look at the stage and look at where you're putting your security and say, oh, there's a clear line of sight from building Z, whatever, to stage. We should probably put someone there. And to have something so basic not be covered is either total incompetence or something worse.
Well, my personal suspicion is that it's something worse. There was a local police officer, a sniper, who was on the ground. He saw the suspect on the roof after he fired the first three I think after the first three, maybe it was all 8. If Crooks fired 8, and I think he probably did, but maybe not. He fired and actually hit Crooks, according to reports that I've read, including the Congressional Oversight Report, and disabled the AR weapon that Crooks had. But then the Secret Service sniper surely was looking through binoculars or a scope. He surely saw what had happened, yet he elected to shoot Crooks in the head and forever silence him. That seemed a little convenient to me, after Crooks his weapon had been disabled and he had been injured in the shoulder, according to the reports. There's another guy that I've read a lot about named Maxwell Urich. Have you heard that name at all?
I don't think so.
All right. I want you and I to research Maxwell Urich. The belief is, I don't know if you saw it or not, but there was a white van that is not in dispute at all, was towed away by local law enforcement after the attempted assassination. It's a white van. There are multiple eyewitnesses who said that it had Arizona tags on it. Certain YouTubers who I happen to have belief in tracked that van back to Urich Ammunitions in Arizona. Maxwell Urich drove that van ostensibly to Butler, Pennsylvania. He has not been seen since July the 13th. His parents filed a missing persons report on July the 14th. He's not been seen or heard from since. Now, here's the last tidbit I'll give you, and I don't mean to get too far off track or down the weeds, but this is important, I think. I think it's damned important that we not wait 65 years to learn the truth about who tried to kill President Trump. But if you look at pictures of the assassin on the roof with blood coming out, the assassin has a notable scar on his ear. Maxwell Urich used to have those big earrings. I don't know what you call them. What do you call them, Q? Gauges. And he took them out. And so his ear healed and there was a scar left. There is no picture, nothing, and no picture I've seen with Crooks having earrings or a scar in his ear. So you look at that picture and Crooks and Urich look very much alike. They're very similar age. And there's a lot of belief that Maxwell Urich had a role in the attempted assassination. He is gone supposedly off the face of the earth. Maybe it's him on top of the roof. I don't know. I'm not saying that it was. And just last point, I'm sitting here saying these things and I'm starting to think, well, I'm just a conspiratorialist. But that is a manipulation to me, pure and simple, to get us to stop asking questions. Because anyone who could invent something like that must be clearly off their rocker and a conspiratorialist. Well, I don't know, but I'm not buying the government line on July the 13th, and I'd like to know more. Maybe you would go research it, and I'll help you.
Maybe, but I will say is that unfortunately, I would not be surprised if it ends up being government incompetence. Just having seen so much over the last, with my experience in government, I can just say I can see that as well. being like a plausible explanation. Like, yes, there are so many people that are so incompetent at all these levels for whatever reasons. That's a whole nother conversation.
That's our next conversation. I'll stay here all afternoon, but I know you've got an appointment. I'm a man of my word. I said an hour and we're at 62 minutes. I need to let you go, but I sure have enjoyed it. Please come back, and best wishes for your book. I know it's going to be a bestseller. And hey, we launched your book tour right here today on The Truth.
Hey, we did it.
I'm
Awesome.
Gordon, and
Thank you so much.
We've heard
Really
a lot of
appreciate you
truth
having me
today.
on.
Thank you, Jack Carr. Best wishes. I hope you enjoyed today's program as much as we enjoyed bringing it to you. We really thank you for tuning in every Saturday, and we appreciate our audience. Write to us, JohnGordonTruth at gmail.com. That's all one word, JohnGordonTruth at gmail.com. Give us your thoughts, comments, criticisms. We'll certainly listen and, if appropriate, respond back to you on the air. I'd like to ask you one small little favor. If you watch us on Gettr or Rumble or YouTube, if you would just go to one of those streaming services and hit the subscribe button, it would do a huge amount of good to help us reach more people. So if you'll just do us that one little favor, I'd really appreciate it. Right now, about 10% of the people who watch us on those streaming services subscribe. So if you're watching on one of them, just hit the subscribe button. It costs you nothing. It takes you about a second. And if you like it, then by all means hit the like button. But if you don't, just move on to Dan Bongino, I reckon. Have a great weekend. It's my pleasure now to welcome a friend and a great Georgian, the chairperson of the DeKalb County GOP. And I've had the delightful pleasure of getting to know Marci McCarthy over the last couple of years. And she is a fighter, and I admire that. That's what we need in order to be able to get this train back on the track, in my view, one of which is election integrity. And Marci, you just filed a lawsuit on the behalf of the DeKalb County GOP against Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State in Georgia, alleging, as I understand it, that the Dominion machines failed to meet the certification test as required by law. Can you kind of step us through this and tell us about this lack of encryption that you've uncovered? And I should also mention that Marci runs an IT company and has an extensive background in cybersecurity, uniquely qualifying her to have this conversation. So Marci, welcome.
Well, thanks, John, for having me. It's always a pleasure to see you. And well, it is quite a historic lawsuit that we have filed on behalf of the DeKalb Republican Party here in Georgia, and it is against the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger. And what it is really over serious concerns and violations of state and federal security requirements as it pertains to our Dominion, Georgia voting systems. And in a nutshell, they're not protecting the encryption keys properly, and they're in clear text. So they're not in a cyber vault as a best practice industry standard, as well as required by law. Additionally, the passwords themselves are being, what we've identified in multiple counties and multiple states, are being used and not replenished after each election or refreshed, and they're not assigned to users, going against, again, everything that in the cybersecurity world that should not be happening. And when you make your touting, as Gabe Sterling has, and Secretary of State Raffensperger has here in Georgia and on social media, that we have the most secure and safe elections, inclusive of our equipment, it gives us great pause as Georgians, as cybersecurity professionals, that is not true in the case here.
So you filed a lawsuit in Fulton County. I guess, did you choose Fulton County because that's where the state capital and Raffensperger are? Is that why you chose Fulton?
Yes, that is exactly why.
And you got my favorite judge, Judge McAfee, the guy with such great courage and who punted to the Court of Appeals. He couldn't afford to tell Fani Willis that she had lied, that she had abused her power, that she had demonstrated incredibly bad judgment and violated all the ethics that we would expect from a public official. So he just said, oh, there's an air of mendacity, And I invite you to file an interlocutory appeal. In other words, I'm not going to do my job, but maybe the Court of Appeals will, so the voters of Fulton County will vote me back in. And I won't go home and have to tell my lovely wife that I don't have a job and a way to support our family anymore. To me, that's how I interpret it. So he recused himself in your case, and now I guess it'll be reassigned to another judge. I mean, do you know where that stands?
Judge McAfee is our judge, and we have a court date on September 30th, so he's still our judge.
Now, I just read that he had filed a motion to recuse himself because of the case that he's got against Stefani Willis 19.
My attorney hasn't shared that with me, but it might be breaking news then, actually, overall. So I'll have to check that after we get off our interview to see that is the case. But he was signed on the court paperwork for September 30th at 9 a.m. in Fulton Superior Court as of an hour ago.
So what I read, let's see if I can find a date line here with a timestamp. No, but it's from the Atlanta Civic Circle. I don't know them, but when I Googled your lawsuit, this came up. And it says that the case was assigned to Fulton Superior Court Judge Scott McAfee. However, he has filed a motion to recuse from this case because he is also overseeing the state RICO case alleging interference in 2020 presidential election against former President Donald Trump and multiple co-defendants. Several other Fulton Superior judges have also recused.
What I saw in the last little while that Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones was not going to be charged with anything. That did come out, so maybe it's all part of that makeup. Additionally, last 24 hours, it did get announced that 2 charges on that particular case that you just referenced were dropped as well. So maybe it's just all commingled in there because of the conflicts and the overlaps of different things overall. But certainly I'll have to get back to you.
I'm not trying to draw you into this, but my paradigm is that this system is rotten. It is rotten to the core. Fani Willis is engaging in lawfare. She's traveled to Washington and met with the White House counsel multiple times before the lawsuit was filed. And, you know, I worked on election integrity. I worked very hard with Bob Shealy on the case against the Fulton Board of Elections. I've seen the evidence. This notion that people are asserting without evidence and falsely claiming, just like David Muir said in the debate earlier this week, without evidence. It's just a lie. They are lying and then calling the people that talk about election interference the big lie. And so theirs is the bigger lie. And it is so distressing to me. Why would Brad Raffensperger and Gabe Sterling, who you referenced, not want honest, free, fair elections?
I don't speak for the two of them, and I certainly don't have the same mindset, but our situation is completely alarming, hence why we brought forth and a lawsuit of the nature that we did. So just to put it in layman's terms and a sort of analogy for everybody out there at home, we all have passwords to our computers and our different systems. And, you know, you do want to protect them overall. So a lot of systems have added multi-factor authentication where they send you a text message. You're asked if you're human when you're logging into different types of accounts. Well, in this instance, they have the sticky note basically on the front of the vault. So anytime that anybody wants to go into the vault, just has to look at the sticky note, open the vault, and go inside and help themselves and then close the door. So there's no audit trail. There's no record of them going in there, no sign-in sheets. And that's pretty scary when you really think about this is our most sacred right as an American to be able to vote and trust and verify our elections. And we just went through 4 years ago of some pretty hellacious activity, and we're not trying to relitigate 2020. We're simply trying to protect our vote for 2024.
100%. You could not have said it better. And, you know, I keep talking about 2020, not because I want to relitigate. We're not going to change anything about 2020. That ship has sailed. The die is cast. But I don't want it to happen again. And if we stick our head in the sand and pretend like, oh, everything was okay in 2020, most honest, secure election ever, we're opening the door and saying, come on, do it again. Why wouldn't they? And then you have people like Raffensperger and Sterling who are continuing to double down on. So did you have dialogue with the Secretary of State prior to filing your lawsuit?
We did not have dialogues directly. Well, the only dialogue, I should say, let me take a step back. Secretary Raffensperger's general counsel, Charlene McGowan, was notified of the violations back in March of 2024, and they did nothing to correct it. They've kicked and screamed about a lot of this overall, but they have gone on a health type of tour, handing out awards to all over the state to election office workers and leadership, posing for pictures and speeches at Rotary clubs. And quite frankly, going on the media and attacking our state board of elections, it's just really unseemly. And when your Secretary of State is an adversary versus an advocate for its constituency, you really have to wonder what the motivation is overall and why so many people are angry, because he's more contentious than, anything of building consensus with us.
Well, it's just amazing to me. The person who the voters entrusted to protect their vote is not doing it. And it's overt. And I don't have a clue what his motivations are. It seems to me that he may be living in some sort of alternate reality, that he thinks that people are so stupid that they're not going to see what he is doing. You've heard the rumors. I've heard the rumors. I don't know what end is up. All I know is that the result is that we do not have secure elections. The disappointing thing to me is that we've got people like yourself, Garland Favorito, Joe Rossi, and David Cross, others who have worked really hard to try and educate people and disclose the problems with our elections. And the Secretary of State's office seems to, instead of embracing the information and working to improve the system, that they push back, double down. There's nothing to see here, nothing wrong.
Well, they want us to, have secure elections, and that's what they talk about. But certainly they want us to trust them. But we also have right as citizens to verify them, verify our vote to ensure that the vote that we've cast is actually legal. And we've got to ensure that illegals are not casting votes, but that's certainly not what about our lawsuit is happening. We have a lot of other issues out there overall, but what we're simply asking for is proof after the fact, after the elections close on November 6th by 7 p.m. to see the log files of all the systems to ensure that no one compromised it because they don't have good record keeping and overall in the cast ballot images and the ballots themselves. Just ensure what has happened on November 5th and the 18 days of early voting plus our no recent absentee ballot voting is all up to snuff. That's all we're asking for. We're not asking you to take the machines out. We're not asking for anything, any software upgrades. We're simply asking the Secretary of State of Georgia to allow us to trust and verify our vote on November 6th.
Didn't the Georgia legislature actually enact a law that was signed by the governor saying that ballots are subject to open records and that they are public records that are subject to being requested by citizens?
That was definitely part of the new legislation that just passed in this go-around and signed into law. So we had a lot of new legislation on this batch, or this session, I should say, that definitely is going to move things forward and continues to ensure our fitness, faith, integrity, and trust in our elections. I'm proud of the work that many people that you mentioned and more have done in the state of Georgia. And I'm really honored to be a part of this movement because when I look back what happened in 2020, again, not trying to relitigate, but I'm just trying to look forward and lessons learned so that we don't have to repeat what happened in 2020. And when we're here on November 6th, we're confident with the outcome of our elections and every citizen can move forward. And we can move forward with a peaceful transition of power. That's simply why I'm here.
Well, you look back historically, Hillary Clinton claimed that she was robbed of her election, that there were election irregularities. Stacey Abrams claimed that she was rightfully elected governor of Georgia over Brian Kemp. And Donald Trump in 2020, and I and many, many others agree that he was deprived his second term because of a fraudulent election. I cannot speak for any other state, but I have seen the evidence in Georgia. And so why can we not all join hands and agree on this one simple premise that it works in everybody's interest to have free, fair, honest elections? The only reason I can think of is that the Democrats want to cheat. They know that the Republicans don't cheat, and that gives them obviously an unfair advantage. Your thought?
Oh, I agree with you. When you're over the target, as we repeatedly are, and they're also not used to being challenged, John. That's quite obvious. We're seeing it across the board. So I asked several of my attorney friends out there, was this ever like this in preemptive going into an election like it was in, as we're seeing in 2024 versus 2020 or 2016? And quite frankly, no one ever litigated before an election. It was always done after the fact. And you had to do things at face value to certify the election so that that candidate could contest their race. So I feel like we're getting ahead of the curve, but they're not used to being challenged, at their own little sport of lawfare. So it's actually kind of interesting to watch them kind of react and play the stunts that they're suing over. So just yesterday, for example, in DeKalb County at our Board of Elections meeting, the same thing that they're suing the state Board of Elections over, they pulled a fast one specifically and tried to do resolutions within a few hours of posting an agenda and slammed it through without the 30-day notice, not the opportunity for discussion, so violating federal and state law. And they did that in DeKalb County yesterday. And that is the third bluest county, formerly the second bluest county in the state of Georgia. And we're really proud of going down that list because we're fighting the Democrats every single day. We have down ballot candidates on our ballot, 11 of them specifically. We doubled the Republican voter turnout in 2022 from 2018 and increased the margins of victory by 11% in that general election in 2022. So we're fighting back. We're playing a game of offense. We're not sitting here and taking it. And we're watching and we're responding and we're being proactive where we need to be proactive. So we're not waiting till November 6th to say, hey, this election was stolen. We're trying to prevent one from happening right before our very eyes. And I'm really, again, proud of the work that many people across Georgia are doing. And we have the support of the RNC, which is really exciting, and the Georgia GOP, and just many others across the board that are very committed to ensure fitness, what I like to say, faith, integrity, and trust in our elections, but protecting our vote overall.
Well, you certainly have my encouragement and my endorsement. Thank you for what you're doing. Judge Totenberg in Curling versus Raffensperger in 2020 said that the Dominion machines are unreliable, but there was insufficient time to correct it before the election. Well, that was 4 years ago, and that case is still pending. Nothing has happened, and now you found out that the encryption that is required to be there evidently is not, and that the passwords are largely in the public domain, meaning that anybody can crack into any voting machine if they have a laptop and a little bit of computer knowledge, is what I'm hearing you say. Is that right? Have I got it?
That is correct. So with illicit or licit access to the voting machines, you have the ability to change information on those voting machines and be undetected. So absolutely.
Well, that is just unconscionable. And I pray and I hope that you get a fair judge with a backbone that cares about our country, our Constitution, and the franchise. The vote is the pillar, the foundation of our republic. With that, we are a third world country at best. Keep fighting, Marci. Thank you for coming on The Truth today. Marci's told you the truth, and I'm John Gordon. We'll be right back. I hope you enjoyed our time with Jack Carr as much as I did. I found the conversation absolutely fascinating and him to be a very intriguing and interesting person. I hope you enjoyed it. For our Atlanta listeners, you have a special opportunity. A week from tomorrow, Sunday, September 29th, you can go see Jack Carr in person at the Atlanta History Center, right there in the middle of Buckhead. It is a beautiful, wonderful facility. You can see the cyclorama and the train that was commandeered from Chattanooga, and Jack Carr. He will be in McElrath Hall at 3 p.m. from 3 to 5. You can get your tickets for members. They're only $6. For non-members, $12. Go to www.atlantahistorycenter.com and you can reserve your spot. I'm going to make an effort to be there. I hope you will. That's The Truth. I'm John Gordon.